Welcome back, everyone. I'm so thrilled that you're still here with us, and it's my delight and pleasure to introduce and to welcome onto the virtual stage Laura Euland and George Rice. I first want to thank Rita Salazar for sharing her story with us and helping to reflect the importance of this work, which I think is great grounding as Laura and George begin to share with us now the work of the 911 Professional Career and Supports Work Group. Thank you for being here, and I will turn it over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hello, everyone. Glad you came back. Welcome to the 911 Professional Career and Supports Report Out. My name is Laura Euland. I'm with Valleycom 911. We are a regional police, fire, and medical 911 center serving 24 agencies and a population of about 800,000 in King County, Washington, which is that area of Seattle, the Seattle area that Sean talked about. I suspect that Sean lives in our service area, south of Seattle. I started at Valleycom as a dispatcher back in 1981 and have had the very good fortune to serve as executive director since 2011. And as I mentioned, as this session kicked off this morning, the topic of transforming 911 to include the well-being and the care of the 911 professional is one that I deeply care about. As someone who has sat behind the phones and the radio, I know firsthand the stress, trauma, and toll this job brings to the people doing the work. I also know the deep satisfaction and personal pride that comes from bringing help to people in their worst moments. These emotions and more exist in a public safety telecommunicators every shift, every day. So Transform 911 presented a unique opportunity to help develop, propose, and present radical and needed improvements to the entire 911 system. And it allowed me to focus specifically on those that I knew best, and that being the 911 professional. So I am very fortunate to be joined by someone who has vast experience with 911. He is quick to say it's not under the headset, but it is certainly within the industry. And he knows the government landscape and how to get things done. I hit the lucky ticket when I got George. So I'll ask him to introduce himself now.
Thanks very much, Laura. And the feeling is indeed mutual. As noted on the slide, I'm George Rice. I'm managing partner for Skyhawk Global. We're a consultancy that serves those who serve the public sector. And I think the issues we've discussed so far and that we'll continue to discuss over the next 3 days are so critical to perhaps most critically the thing that is of criticality, and that is public safety service in 911. I've had the privilege of leading 2 associations in this space where I worked closely with public and private sector practitioners, 911 professionals, and those industry leaders who support their efforts. I participated in an array of examinations about challenges associated with ensuring 911 systems operate effectively on all fronts, and I've also witnessed the commitment both groups have to ensuring the success of 911 as a nationwide service. I suspect my experience as someone who has gone into harm's way in the service of the public has also helped me sort of appreciate how necessary and important a high-functioning 911 system is to the country. So I also feel privileged to work on this project and to contribute to this effort. Thanks again, Laura.
Thank you, George. So I want to sort of tell everyone about how we got to our recommendations. We'll introduce some of our members of our work group, who many are on this call. But to get the work group started, George and I began by brainstorming on who we should ask to participate. And we developed a list and we started recruiting. And with very few exceptions, people said yes right away. They were eager and excited to be a part of something that would highlight, that would recognize and enrich the lives of the 911 pro. And we are very grateful that they said yes. Our work group today is about 21 members strong, including George and I. They're listed on this and the following slide, and I suspect that there will be some familiar faces to you. 13 of the participants reported as we had personal knowledge of or interactions with these individuals. We knew them to be thoughtful and caring, creative people, many with direct experience in the 911 field, either by wearing the headset or working in management, and some have done both, or they work closely with 911 centers and are familiar with the environment. The other members that we asked were They're just as thoughtful, caring, and creative. We asked them to join as they provided a different perspective as someone outside of 911, but we believe they would still be relevant to our mission. They brought the freedom from the "we've always done it this way" thinking, which helps spark the creativity needed for some transformational thinking. Transformation calls for radical ideas, and that's what this whole project is about, all 6 work groups. Early on, we agreed that if we stayed within our own area of expertise, we would likely create a very inefficient echo chamber, and nobody wanted that. The kickoff meeting of our work group was in late October, and the group decided we would meet twice a month, and we started talking through at a very high level what our purpose was, how we fit in with the bigger Transform 911 effort, basically just getting our thoughts out and getting to some sense of how we were going to proceed. We felt that reviewing the current realities of working in 911 was foundational in building the recommendations that you'll see later. We needed to orient those members new to 911. Like Sean said earlier, he didn't know what he didn't know when it came to 911. And since we had members in our work group that also didn't know what they didn't know, we took the time to share what our realities were. A bit challenging with that because there is no one flavor of 911. There's some very small centers, there's large centers, independent centers that answer to a board. And then there's centers housed within a city or a county government who may answer to a chief or a sheriff. There's even private companies that contract with jurisdictions to provide 911 service. So there's no one type of 911 center. And the challenges we fleshed out as we talked through those realities, and probably not surprising to many of you, there were definitely common themes that turned up regardless of the type of center. And of course, our end goal was to develop recommendations to address those challenges while also addressing the well-being of the 911 Pro. Well-being was and is a very important element in our conversations and within the entire Transform 911 work. Well-being, we think, is a human being priority. So you might say, what do we mean by well-being? This was our working definition. And this is what we keep in mind as we're thinking, as we work towards the work group goals. The universe of everyone in this definition here is the 911 professional, because that's the focus of our work group. But within that universe of the 911 professional, there are individuals who come from different cultures, ethnicities, backgrounds, experiences, beliefs. And we believe that each person is unique, each one is important, and each one is to be celebrated. So that's how we got that's how we formed the work group and centered ourselves on our mission. And then next, I'll speak to how we got to the draft recommendations that we'll be sharing with you today. One of the first things the work group tackled was defining what a 911 Pro is, so that we know who we're talking about and who we're keeping in our sights. Without a definition of a target audience, we knew it would be very easy to have a great, meaningful conversation, rich and deep. Before long, we're sharing these fantastic ideas, and then we surface and go, these are great, but these don't get us to our mission, and we are off topic, and we did not want that to happen. So we came up with this definition that the 911 professional is the call taker who answers the phone, who's the one talking to the caller, and who within just a few seconds must figure out the where and what of the emergency and enter a call for service. We're talking about the dispatcher who is alerting the field responders, getting them to the right place with the information that is obtained in those few seconds, and then manages the resources needed to resolve the emergency and all the other emergencies that are occurring at the same time. In some centers, the call taker and the dispatcher are the same person. In other centers, there's different people in those roles. But in all centers, the 911 Pro are the people who directly handle the calls that come in 24 hours a day, every day. But you'll also see in this definition, there's related personnel. And we felt it was important to include them as well. So who are they? Related personnel are those who make it possible for the call taker to answer the phone and for dispatchers to send responders. They manage the systems and processes that keep the phones working, the paychecks flowing, and the training happening. And the related personnel are usually unseen and unheard by public in the units, but still very much a part of delivering 911 service to a community. Because trainers train the 911 pro, HR recruits, hires, and does a whole lot more. CAD admin manage the computer aided dispatch, which is what CAD means, which is the primary tool, one of the primary tools in the Convening. The GIS admin manage the mapping systems that help locate callers and the field units through the GPS devices in their rigs. Of course, the radio techs keep the radio system up and running, which is the other primary tool. There's public records to respond to information requests. The legal team, directors, management, other people needed, all of them. But the point here is to highlight that it takes an enormous amount of resources and specialty skills to provide 911 service. Whether it's a small center or a large center, you still need some element of these people. So that's why we included them in the definition, is without them, 911 really isn't possible. So as a way of introducing ourselves to the other workgroup members, we asked everyone a question, and that was, what do you hope to accomplish as being a part of this work group and the larger Transform 911 effort? And these were the answers. Each one of these is important. They're not listed here in any order of priority. Each one is complex, and while each could stand alone as a separate focus, we saw there was some connectivity amongst them, which led us to consider the bowling pin analogy, which is what one pin that if we knocked it down would either knock down the other pins or at least get them wobbling. And as we talked through this analogy, George had said, you know, we may not need to knock over all the pins to score a win. But that last one that's listed on the screen here, to use our collective voices to uplift recommendations, that one is shared by all the work groups. It was mentioned in the earlier session this morning. We know there's overlap within the work groups, and we recognize that we can further everyone's recommendation by echoing certain calls for action. And we will talk more about the goals as well later on, you'll see them. But back to the bowling pin analogy. So one of the contributors to high turnover rates in this industry is the lack of recognition for the 911 pro. We're just not seen or recognized as a first responder. So the discipline, that's the actual first point of contact, the gateway to emergency help, is seen by the federal government as a clerical position. That's not a judgment statement by the federal government. This is because of data that they receive, job descriptions and other things that showed them that this was a clerical position. And I know for a fact I'm preaching to the choir here because I've seen who's on this call, but 911 professionals are literal lifesavers. They are not administrative file clerks, and I'm not discounting file clerks or secretaries or any other profession, but I am saying their role and 911's role are not the same. So the emotional and mental trauma that 911 pros are subjected to on a daily basis is further compounded when they are told that their skills and contributions are not considered to be on par with other public safety disciplines. But you'll note that crossing guards are. So we know that working towards achieving reclassification, which will provide for improved health and retirement benefits, which again speak to their well-being, that will positively impact recruitment and retention and will set the pin to wobbling. Okay, next slide then. So we know our purpose. We have the guidance of well-being in our minds. We know the people centered in our discussions, and we know what we want to achieve. So we started talking. We didn't close the door to other topics and ideas that came up. Questions were encouraged, other topics were explored, and talking is good. It was healthy. listening even better. But after a while, members started asking about how and when are we going to get to done? How are we going to start building these recommendations? Or as one member said, how are we going to land this plane? And really, we assured the members that they'd been working towards that goal all along. It was in the conversations that the recommendations were being formed. And again, it was the questions, it was the talking, it was the listening. All of that was providing the building blocks that were needed. And then after a while, themes of the discussions began emerging. So next slide. And here's what we saw that was threaded throughout our conversations. There really is a limited understanding on what the 911 professional does, the scope of their work, the difficulty, the technical aspects. This is actually true within other public safety disciplines, police, fire, and medical, and the public themselves. It is certainly not what you see on the TV shows. The other theme that came out was that the 911 industry has limited clout. So although there are organizations and associations like NINA and APCO, there's not a unifying voice, and there's not a unifying labor presence, such as the Fraternal Order of Police or International Association of Firefighters. There's not there just isn't that type of association or voice directly for 911 that has the clout that some of those other organizations have. There's limited direct access to federal policymakers. And recruiting and retaining qualified, trained employees, it's getting harder all the time. You heard that from Rita. She actually works at my facility. And she's right. The entire workforce mindset has shifted. And today's workforce is looking for freedoms and schedules, work from home options, more flexibility than the typical 911 center can provide today. Applicants aren't as interested. Like she said, where we used to have hundreds of people applying for jobs, we've seen that number dwindle sometimes to single digits. And current employees are leaving for jobs that do offer that flexibility. The field is not fully prepared for a current crisis, let alone emerging challenges. That speaks to training and technology. Within 911, there isn't a national requirement on the type or amount of training a 911 pro must have to do the job. Only 31 states have a requirement at all that their employees be certified as having a minimum level of training. And that means that 19 states have none. And I don't mean to say that there isn't any training. Of course there is. The job is much too technical to do without training. But how much, the content, continuing education hours, all of that is not clearly defined or required in the other states. Well, my colleagues and I in Washington State, some of whom are on this call, are currently advocating very hard, even today, like 20 minutes ago, for legislation that would set up a volunteer board to determine minimum training requirements. Without training certification standards, individual 911 center leadership may not consider training a priority. And that doesn't serve the 911 pro or the public very well. But also related to the current crisis and not being fully prepared, that's a technology issue as well, which is a focus of another Transform 911 work group. Technology advancements for public safety is not on the same pace as the private sector, and the technology is very expensive. The required dollars often competes with police and fire budgets. So the 911 pro may not have sufficient training or tools needed to do their job. And then calls leading to help, harm, or somewhere in between for this work group speaks to the mental and emotional impact on the 911 pro themselves of hearing call after call of pain, trauma, and horrors. It also speaks to the reality that most 911 pros have limited options on who to send in response to calls for help, which is also a heavy load to bear because, as Rita said, we're helpers. We want to help. So we want to send the right help. But having the alternative response, of course, is the focus of the group that we just heard from. So these are more examples of where there's overlap and where we can use our collective voice to uplift recommendations. And next slide. So we also looked at the data as Transform 911 seeks to evaluate the evidence base surrounding the current 911 system, identify its limitations, and search for opportunities to innovate alternative approaches. There's been good work done on behalf of 911, and as one member said, we need to not reinvent the wheel, but stand on the shoulders of those that have come before. A literature review conducted for us revealed the challenges that affected the well-being of the 911 Pro, and our work group members considered this information as we drafted our recommendations. None of these surprised us, but it did serve as evidence that we are on the right track. It does, a lot of it does boil down to data, but it reinforced the importance of and the critical need to transform 911 by addressing these realities. I'll say it again, this is an infrastructure issue, and we have to fix this crumbling infrastructure. Next slide. So here is a list of our first draft recommendations. I'll say again, draft. It's also our first attempt at landing the plane. And there are 4 key topics, and each have several subcomponents. Again, very much in draft. This is why we're bringing them to you. We want your feedback, your reactions, your suggestions to refine them. Following this convening, we and all the top work groups will take the information shared and consider how to incorporate it. We know there's going to be some great ideas. If you are just joining us, please keep in mind that our work group's focus is on the health and well-being of the 911 professional. So it's the men and the women wearing the headset and the folks within the emergency communication center who support them. There are other work groups looking at the different aspects of the 911 system. So briefly, we want to ensure recognition of 911 pros. This includes reclassification. We want to lift that veil that's obscuring the unique and technical contributions made by the pro every day, and to include them in the public safety ranks of uniformed personnel. We want to reintroduce America to 911. It has been 54 years since the first 911 call was placed. And it was pointed out earlier in the chat, not everybody in the US even has 911 still. But the industry has changed and the world has changed. Certainly the workforce has changed. We see opportunity to promote 911 as a career path, standing alongside police and fire and medical and other first responders. We recommend to invest in workforce development and inclusive hiring processes. There is a critical shortage of 911 professionals nationwide. The data shows that most 911 center personnel do not reflect the demographic composition of the communities they serve. There's an opportunity to change that, to change what we've always done and get different, better, more inclusive results in recruitment strategies. And then our 4th recommendation is to take active measures to foster career development and retention. We envision a toolkit building on what others have already done to ensure agencies provide a safe environment for their 911 pros to keep them growing, advancing, and engaged, and still provide the life-saving services the public needs. Whew. So that's the work done to date by our work group. And as we did in the last session, we want this opportunity for you to share with us your thoughts on it. George is going to take over now and walk us through the recommendations in more detail and ask you some questions. So I will turn it over to George.
Great, thanks very much, Laura, appreciate that. And for the detailed overview of our work as well. And indeed, thanks very much for your partnership in addressing these complex issues. It's such a treasure working alongside you. So, and we have much more to do, but thank you very much for the path we've been on so far. And similar thanks to all the work group members as well. They have dedicated quite a bit of time to addressing these issues twice per month for many months now. So it's good to have been working with them also. Much appreciated, team. And of course, thank all of you for staying with us today and joining this session. So let's get to the 4 recommendations from our work group one by one. I'm essentially going to take a few minutes to detail each one of them a little more deeply. Then we'll have a virtual conversation about each one, where insights and experiences can be shared as we did earlier in the very first session. So next slide, please, to slide 15. Thank you. The work group came to the conclusion that aligning the federal classification of 911 professionals with the actual job, its distinct responsibilities, and their critical services performed will not only add truth to the classification, but it can also be an impetus for needed advancements. While some states have taken action on this front, as had been discussed earlier, the work group recommends advocating for federal reclassification by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics from office and administrative support to protective service occupation. Our discussions took these thoughts a bit farther by noting that the field should leverage reclassification and craft a public safety awareness campaign about the 911 profession to advocate for competitive salaries, benefits commensurate with other public safety services and the like, to include retirement benefits, medical benefits, and mental health supports. And next slide, please. I know we'll get to a couple of questions here shortly. I know someone asked about when the classifications are reviewed. Hold that for just a moment and we'll dig in here in just a second. So to explore this recommendation, here are our guiding questions for the virtual discussion. The standard occupational classification, SOC, system's decision not to reclassify is based on PSAP or ECC job descriptions. The SOC goes back to sample in 2024. So does the group have any suggestions to ensure that accurate information is submitted? And as we did on the previous, well, I'll just read this other question. We'll go back to the Mentimeter in a moment here. And what should be done that hasn't already been done essentially as well? We want to dig in deeply on that side. Okay, so let's talk about these. And there we go. Okay, we are coming up here shortly with the Mentimeter. So please share your thoughts and we'll dig in along the way here. Slowly up, coming. As that's coming together, I'll share with you that the classifications were reviewed in 2017 and 2018, and that 2024 date that I mentioned is the next time they'll come up for review. And in the midst of that, what we'll need to ensure is that the job description that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has is accurate to the position such that then we can move forward collectively with reclassification based on an accurate picture. Still looking for some responses in the Mentimeter. I take it everyone has the URL they can go to, and the code is listed there on the slide. Feel free to enter your thoughts there. I know this group, you're usually not this quiet. There are so many things to talk about along the way. Like we did with the group earlier today, we certainly want to dig in and get your insights, build on what the recommendations have done so far, keep things moving forward, and ensure that the field has all the information it needs to make the best next steps happen. So we have a brave soul who's dug in a little bit here. Understanding that 911 pros resolve emergency situations by talking people through them, reducing the need for other responders on site. Indeed, I think that is a key feature of what has to be communicated to the federal government with regard to the classification process, and also in states and localities that are looking to do the same. And clarifying the difference in the training side, I think, is crucial as well. 911 and 988 are related, but they are different. Sample job descriptions are certainly going to be key. That's something that has been used in the past. And I think, again, a clearer picture of the criticality of 911 as a profession and as a service is going to be very crucial as we take that next step towards moving towards classification. Continual education is clearly going to be something that has to go, not just for reclassification, but in terms of the growth of the profession in general as well. Okay,
Does anyone have thoughts on, we say that we need to have job descriptions that are accurate, and in the chat, 911.gov does have a sample job description here. And I know in our state, we pushed that out to 911 leadership to make sure. But how do we get that word out to everybody, the importance of getting that done? Everything hinges on the data that the SOC is going to pull. So ideas on that.
Thanks, Laura. Crucial point to make as well. I'm sure some of our attendees have actually been involved in either the federal campaign for reclassification or their state campaigns as well. Would love to hear what you've done or thoughts you had for things that have not yet been done as well. Retirement benefits has certainly been a huge part of this. That's been a large part of the group's discussion as well, bringing some level of parity from the 911 profession to be in line with all of the other public safety professions has been critical as we moved along also. Collecting data is most certainly something we're doing along the way or advocating that happens. As you've probably seen in the chat before, there's some research that speaks to these issues, and we need to continually grab more data along the way because it is a very complete research probe so far, but it needs a little bit more here and there, and you guys can help us really identify those gaps that we need to address. So we need to analyze the real-time work and identify the true skills, competencies that we take to the job to push it forward. Indeed, so that kind of harkens back to my comments earlier about structuring the actual job description, what really happens within the context of the day-to-day of it all. We need to anticipate that there are industry players building businesses on desk skilling, that work with 911 algorithms, et cetera. Certainly that is indeed the case. And I mentioned earlier that the partnership between the public sector that does the work within the context of emergency communication centers and the private sector that supports them certainly do need to work in tandem, because we wouldn't want to put a technology in the field that is not applicable, which certainly we wouldn't want to have happen. And then also things that can't be trained easily and or implemented easily. Certainly those are features. And thank you for the correction there, Janet, on de-skilling. The overarching job description could be developed and provided to the SOC. That is indeed a feature of what should happen for the 2024 review as well. Okay, we've got a bunch of coming in here. I understand that Natalie has a question. Just to clarify, does sampling refer to surveying, interviewing 911 responders and professionals, or looking and trying to find that? Thanks for correcting me on that, Sarah. There it is. I see it in the chat there as well. Surveying 911 professionals, responders, and professionals, or looking at job descriptions and documentation. So yes, indeed, that is distinctly what would need to happen along the way. So as we begin again to look at building towards 2024 in that review, all of those features have to be gathered, compiled into a cogent job description that really fits the profession accurately, and that needs to be then presented to the federal government. And indeed, states along the way that are re-examining what the role looks like within the context of their labor justifications also. Or anything that, as a professional in this field, that your attention is called toward?
I'm curious on one comment that was entered about it. This shouldn't fall solely on the ECC, the Emergency Communications Center. Who else should it fall on? And who's our partners in this?
See one comment that says the public should be involved in ensuring that 911 moves along.
So we're going to talk in a bit about a marketing campaign. So perhaps
Yeah.
that suggestion is to include the public in a marketing campaign.
Yeah, and the comment about can dispatchers suggest how to categorize calls for data purposes. There is another group that is focusing deliberately on that on the operations side. And as such that it might also pertain to the job description, I think that's something that should be gathered and pulled into the reclassification process as well, so that the full understanding is out there through the federal government and hopefully through policymakers that would then take up the cause. Okay, we've gathered quite a bit on this one. Perhaps we should move on to the other question in this section as well. What should be done that hasn't yet been done? Okay. The Mentimeter should be up in just a moment here. And notice, Chris, you have in the comments here, I think it should be both document review, quantitative analysis, and interviewing of the professionals in the field. I think you make a great point here in that as we move along through the information gathering process, multiple voices, and certainly including those here on this call today, really should be part of that. Otherwise, it will not be a complete picture. So thank you for adding that to the fold here. And indeed, funding comes up quite a bit in our discussions. And I think there wasn't a meeting that went by that we didn't talk to some extent or refer to funding. That's going to be critical. Certainly, existing funding levels can be problematic for call centers. Action by Congress, indeed. But other angles have not yet been explored to ensure that we raise the profile of the need for the change in the classification of this position. Yes, and as Laura alluded to there, we want to talk about some level of a campaign that raises the awareness about these issues, in particular with the public itself. We'll let this one go for just a couple more minutes and move along to our next recommendation. Any more thoughts on perhaps what we should do that hasn't perhaps yet been done? Getting mayors and county administrators involved in the plea to Congress. Indeed so, I think that is another way to go. Local officials are crucial to the delivery of 911 because while it is obviously a nationwide system, it is delivered locally, and the only thing that's really national is the number itself. So I think getting those elected officials at the local level is going to be critical. And presenting to their associations would indeed be helpful as well.
So I like the comment there, increased positive representation in film, TV, maybe a documentary, or I know there's several podcasts out there that are doing great work towards highlighting it. We had talked about maybe an NPR type of campaign also.
Indeed, that'll also be critical. Awareness has to really touch so many points for it to move along. Engaging peers at the dispatch level, another great comment there. With regard to the infrastructure bill, certainly there can be funding assistance towards the center itself, perhaps focused on the technology side, but as that funding increases in one layer of a center, certainly some could be then available for other elements we're speaking of here with regard to the profession and the like. So those are certainly considerations that should be examined. And clearly educating the public about 911, what it is, who answers the call, how professionals are recruited, hired, and trained. Absolutely critical, which is essentially something we want to talk about next. So as we can sort of chalk all of these up to great suggestions along the way, as we have so far, perhaps we should move along to our next slide and continue on with examining these recommendations as they came out of the group. Okay, so looking at, there we go. Can we go back one slide there, please, if you would? Okay, thank you very, very much. So let's pick up there. Essentially, what we wanted to do here is to look at how the awareness angles could be of advantage. So a significant part of this recommendation comes from the group's thinking that the 911 profession is not fully understood by the American public and may thereby be underappreciated for its sophistication and close connection to the field units that are dispatched to emergencies. To help with this, we concluded, thus far, because it's still evolving, that a national marketing campaign should be developed, including recruitment tools, local agencies, for those local agencies, to promote national recognition and acceptance that the 911 industry is, and there's a series of recommendations that are sub-bullets to that, that it is as essential to public health and safety as police, fire, and emergency medical services, separate from and equal to other services, a viable and desirable career choice for public service-minded people, a system whose funding, and often the lack thereof, the American public should be concerned about, and a service that's committed to representing the communities it serves. So if we can go to the next slide, slide 18, please, we can dig into our discussion here. Thank you. So to explore this recommendation, here are the guiding questions for our virtual discussion. When you hear a marketing campaign, what comes to mind? What elements should be included or considered in a national marketing campaign? Again, as these questions will help us build insights for further exploration and refinement of the recommendation. Okay, we will bring up the Mentimeter again and get your comments in that fashion. Certainly, obviously, we are also monitoring the chat along the way. And I see the comments about the 911 series as well. Sorry, Laura.
I love that. Yep.
Yeah.
Netflix miniseries. We're on it.
Indeed.
I'm going to advocate for either Jason Momoa or Brad Pitt to play.
There we go. And as Laura alluded to, and we haven't gotten full traction on this yet, we are in conversation with National Public Radio about potentially producing a spot that might be helpful along these lines. 911 Crisis Center on the Oxygen Network. I see, Chris, that you've commented on that, but is it accurate? Certainly, along with the other comments going into Mentimeter, please respond to that if you'd like along the way also. And we certainly need to be culturally appropriate and sensitive. Indeed, that's something that's been an undergirding factor of this project all along, most certainly. Key factor to keep in mind and keep at the forefront. Something that is overly scripted or obnoxious, that next to no one retains the information. We certainly want to avoid that. Indeed, a focus in terms of how the campaign would need to be crafted and implemented would have to entail what audiences are actually looking to be addressed. In the midst of that, as there is a diagnosis of that audience, the messages would have to be then built and disseminated that would speak to that audience very directly. So we want to look into what those sensitivities might be based on an audience. Recruitment ads, indeed, great point. See someone's commented on the NPR throughline possibility there as well. And a great comment there on professions are based on values, ethics, training, licensure, et cetera. I think this speaks to a good deal of what we're talking about within the context of this work group over the last many months. The values component has been embedded in our conversations throughout. And I think we need to continually emphasize that, because those who take up this profession do that on a values base. They're looking to contribute to the community. They're looking to be part of what can make the community better, to the solutions that need to be devised. So keeping that word values in place and at the forefront also is going to be crucial for us. Okay, still building here. Quick bursts of information, excellent point. Speak often and always and repeat what has been said is certainly a feature of a campaign along these lines. Language capacities are going to be crucial as well, particularly focused in some areas geographically where English is oftentimes not the primary language. And voices and stories, telling the story, and that's something Laura and I have talked about actually, and the work group has pondered also, using voices and stories of current 911 professionals is absolutely crucial, as you've seen the two videos here today as well. No one can tell the story like the person actually involved in the story. So that's going to be an element that has to run through the entirety of any type of campaign of this nature.
In the chat, there's use social media clips like TikTok. I think that is a smart idea in the fact that you want to reach the workforce and you need to go to where the workforce is, right? And if they're on TikTok, then we should be on TikTok.
Indeed so. Traditional media too much. I can empathize with that, that comment as well. Mainstream media certainly has been the core of information dissemination across our nation for decades. Using social media has taken advantage of the reaching directly to the masses, and I think that has to be a focal point. And certainly that's something that any campaign, frankly, awareness or otherwise, would have to take into account. So thanks for raising that also. Looks like we have Oakland, California prospect there. Tremendous number of comments about 911 because of understaffing. That is certainly a key feature. We're going to talk a little bit about that here in a moment also. Before we take a step forward onto the next one, or anything else that grabbed you that you'd like to comment on?
No, these are all really good. So appreciate everyone's thinking.
Concur, yeah, and TED Talks are always awesome, and they live for quite a while on YouTube also, so that's always a good way to go. Okay, so let's move to our next topic, the next recommendation we want to investigate and look into and get your insights around. So if we could move to the next slide, please, that would be great. Thank you. There we are. Regarding this recommendation from the work group, we discussed the potential value of creating a professional training track similar to other public safety service providers within colleges, technical schools, and workforce development programs, along with the possibility of funding tuition reimbursement or student loan forgiveness activities as well. This recommendation also includes advocacy for subsidies to flagship schools to be early adopters of 911 Pro curricula, and as proof of concept demonstration sites also. We also explored the need to advocate for certification of 911 professionals, similar to certifications required for law enforcement and other emergency service providers that require periodic renewal as well. And our sort of sub-bullet to this, we kind of came up with a few follow-ons to that comment I just made, that certification should include minimum training hours, covering relevant content such as the history, context, and progression of 911 as a public service, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and implicit bias training related to interaction with the public, with coworkers, and with other public safety providers, and training programs that include familiarization on the demographic and socioeconomic background of the jurisdictions served. We also need to ensure that 911 workforces, they're equipped with, or for the challenges, I should say, of today and tomorrow, by including such items as training modules and ECC guidelines to ensure 911 professionals are equipped to address increasing community level events, such as climate emergencies, civil unrest, and mass casualty events. Ensure 911 professionals have a deep understanding of the impacts of race and racism on emergency response and how to mitigate against related negative impacts, and that they see this as a core part of their service to community, and ensure that 911 professionals have the training and equipment to interface with emerging technologies. So let's go to the next slide and explore the questions here. Great, thank you. So our questions are, what are your thoughts on building a community or technical college track? And Do you have related experience or knowledge of where these might already be in place? So let's delve into the Mentimeter and look at the chat and the like. And we're bringing that up here momentarily. I would add that I have seen myself one place where a law enforcement agency is embedded in a university. It's actually my undergrad university, where the local police department in the city where that school is located actually transfers credits from the university into the training academy. So there are examples of these types of things that could be deployed, for example, with 911 as well. I think everyone has seen as well that there are lots of different technical tracks at particularly community colleges on a number of different subjects. There's no reason this couldn't be one of the subjects as well. Okay, still looking for your thoughts and input here, both in the Mentimeter and in chat. Great to hear. Florida has a college certificate along these lines. Thank you very much, Bonnie. Okay, graduates should receive tuition reimbursement. We talked about that, really good point. Someone had in that they've been involved with a couple of programs of this nature. And a survey, indeed, a survey of these types of programs nationwide would be exceedingly helpful. Thank you very much for that as well. That would help us build on the research literature that's been gathered so far. Wake Tech in Raleigh, excellent. Olympia, looks like we do have some things going on in various parts of the country. That's good news. Anytime there's an example that helps us build.
I see a comment there about technical tracks that were not sustainable, lost interest, used as L&I retraining. So some element of refreshing or even a marketing campaign within the technical track will need to be considered, how to keep it relevant.
Yes, good point. And community colleges themselves tend to be resource challenged. So having them take on something would may need to have a funding campaign around it. But sorry, Laura, you were saying?
I remember a conversation about some type of similar structure to a police academy for the 911 professional, not a police academy, but a 911 academy that is
Yes.
a requirement to pass.
Fabulous. And thanks for the comment about the airlines component with the NPR piece. Also, that'll be helpful to review. Great, a bunch of great comments coming in. 988, indeed. Develop more resources where students have a mobile accessible field guide they can use to stay up to date with approaches. That would be fabulous, particularly with regard to how they may be able to transition from a training institute of this nature directly into the training that would be directly in the 911 center. High school guidance counselors, and having been a recipient of that type of guidance myself, I would say that is incredibly useful. Online training is probably going to be, in the case of this, maybe even preferable given the difficulty in pulling people together, even in pre-pandemic environments. So crafting this into a virtual environment is going to be crucial, I think, as well. So great comment there. Thank you for that. Practicums, yeah, indeed. So real life scenarios, I think, are going to be crucial. That was a huge part of, by the way, it's just as an anecdotal comment, a huge part of my training as a DA agent was practical exercises that recreated scenarios and that you had to essentially graduate for each scenario. So those things are always useful. And National Science Foundation grants, excellent. I would add that having also been on the board of directors for a university, these are institutions that never stop fundraising. So they are always looking at avenues to bring in potential new projects and programs that will also help them raise funds, raise the essentially the profile of the institution and the like. So thanks for a couple of those comments along those lines.
From the chat, looks like Nina may have, or at one time had, a working group for high school program curriculum.
Excellent. And Middlesex Community College, looks like they're
Yeah.
involved. Fabulous. So we certainly have a base of learning to pull from with regard to universities or colleges, community colleges in particular, that are always engaged. Philanthropic institutions paying to develop a curriculum or underwrite it. Certainly a very good thought and idea. In particular, right now there are well more than 200 or so foundations that are deeply involved in public safety issues. And there could be comments and conversations with those folks as well. Spending time with the communities to hear things, I think that's a critical piece. This is really good, about a library for practitioners to use to stay abreast of practices. Certainly there are fantastic repositories like 911.gov and both APCO and NINA's websites where you find lots of resources. In terms of another way to feed into those, I think that would be critical also. Not any one place has all of the information, although all organizations that do post reference material do strive to get as comprehensive as they possibly can be. Maybe there's a collaborative moment that's available within that context also. Great comments, yeah. Just keeping an eye on a couple of comments here in our time, folks. Curricula that comports with best practices. Certainly that's critical also. So the field has to be always engaged in creating what that curricula says and teaches.
And on the best practices and standards, the work group is and has been talking about what are the KPIs for the 911, what are the metrics that we're working towards.
Fabulous. And Brian, thank you for the page entry as well. That's great. Okay, I'm looking at our clock, thinking that perhaps we might want to take a step forward here. Give me 1 second to look at the chat. Okay, we've talked about some of that. Let's take another step with our next steps here in terms of where we're going with our next recommendation and how all of you can help us kind of get to where we need to be, frankly. So the work group's thinking here was to develop best practice elements within 911 agencies related to employee well-being, while including employee voices such as peer support and mentorship programs, well-being and recognition programs, and employee sounding boards to provide input on policies and procedures. We also explored how best to identify, encourage, and develop career advancement opportunities within the 911 profession by promoting and/or requiring applicable industry certifications, identifying the skill sets needed for advancement from entry to leadership levels, similar to other public safety service advancement steps, ensuring diversity, equity, and inclusion awareness as an element in all career advancement opportunities, and providing additional training in managerial skills for those promoted to supervisory positions. And to address understaffing, the work group sought to identify funding barriers, as we talked about throughout today as well, such as fee diversion practices and mitigation strategies against those fee diversions. These recommendations also include prospects for